Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 12, the week after spring break. Uh, so, if you live in Nebraska, you know it's been a crazy spring break. More on that in a minute. But I promise this presentation isn't going to be super long. I only have 11 or 12 slides in it. So, let me get right into that. Oh, there's our friend Haley Joel Osment from a movie in 1999 called The Sixth Sense. I even put a link there. Um, to that clip from the movie where the main character says he sees dead people and they're everywhere and they don't know they're dead. And if you saw that movie, you know that it has this big surprise ending um, reference seeing dead people everywhere. But it's an interesting movie because it is sort of this peek into one person's version of, you know, the alternate universe and what certain people might be seeing and what's the connection. So why do I stick that in there? I just say I see policy analysis. It's everywhere, and let me get to that in a minute here. So first, what's coming up in the course? So we are past spring break. We're on the backside of the course, backside of the semester. And here's what's coming up. So this week I have a specific discussion that I want you to engage in, having to do with the difference between what I call a full-blown policy analysis versus a policy brief, and I have a purpose for that, and I'll get to that. But coming up then in weeks 13 and 14, I want to spend a little bit of time allowing you to look more fully at particular policy areas. So in both weeks 13 and 14, I'm asking you to choose a policy topic option. So in week 13, the two options are education or foreign policy / homeland security. That's week 13. And then in week 14, I ask you to select between environmental / energy policy or healthcare policy. So those are basically 4 units. You'll pick 2 in those 2 weeks, and then there will be separate discussions to talk about those policy areas. You know, I want to do that because we do have more diverse interests in the student body, really, in the MPA program overall. So it's really hard to really focus on particular areas to the exclusion of others. So I just want to have this sort of mini course opportunity for you to focus on those things that might pique your interest. And then so we'll be back all together as a committee of the whole, if you will, on week 15, where I ask you to engage in a discussion on suggestions for course improvement. I like to do that. It's separate from the course evals, which are anonymous and which I don't see as an instructor until 6 or 8 weeks after the semester's over. This is more of an open discussion to allow you to give me feedback and give each other feedback on what you might do to improve this course, because I do teach it every year or so, or every couple of years, depending on demand. And then in week 16, you will post your policy analysis presentation. That's the PowerPoint part of the presentation with narration over it on the discussion board. So do see the syllabus on that requirement. And then week 17, which is also known as finals week, that's the week that you will post your policy analysis brief for me to grade, not on the discussion. So the discussion part is the presentation, which gives you an opportunity to share with your classmates what you've been working on, because there are a lot of interesting policy analyses that you all are doing, and I think it's really important as peers to see what the others happen to be looking at in terms of policy. So we got a stark reminder this last week of the intersection of policy and I'll say real-time events. So this is a satellite image. It's a before picture of around the Omaha area, the 7-county area around Omaha, and of course the Missouri River Valley and the Platte and Elkhorn River Valley. So up in the upper left-hand corner in the northwest there is the town of Valley. The town of Valley is called Valley for a reason. It's in that valley between the Platte River, which you see is a little darker on the left, and the Elkhorn River, which doesn't appear to be super wide on the right, and they come to the confluence uh, down south of that a little bit. But the town of Valley really is in literally a flat valley between those two rivers. And then, of course, you see the Platte River as it flows and turns west or turns east, excuse me, um, and that's the dividing line between Sarpy and Cass County there. And then it has the confluence of the Platte and the Missouri River there in the town of Plattsmouth. And so a couple little points of interest there on the Missouri River. There's the Oxbow Lake up to the north, which is Carter Lake, and the Omaha Airport is to the east of that. And then there's that other Oxbow, which extends sort of into Iowa, and that's actually part of Fountain Oak Forest in Bellevue, and just north of that is Lake Manawa in Council Bluffs. So here is a satellite image that is the after of the floods. And so you can see the town of Valley is why it flooded so badly. It's that valley between the Elkhorn and the Platte Rivers really is a flood zone. And so you can see the widening of all the rivers, the Elkhorn especially, which has a narrower channel than the Platte. And so when it breached its banks, it widened more. And then you see the Platte itself expanding all the way to Plattsmouth, and then you see the town of Plattsmouth where the confluence is between the Missouri and the Platte, and that's a large lake. And then of course the area that is Fountain Oak Forest was a lot of that was flooded. It's since gone down, and then you can see to the north of that, to the north of Omaha, north of Carter Lake, wide expansion of river just to the north of Omaha, breaching into Iowa. And now we know that the river, as it continued to crest downstream, flooded Hamburg, Iowa, and some areas in northwest Missouri. So this is a reminder of something. Actually, I think I have a couple more images. I took this, actually just lifted this screenshot of the Nebraska 509 road conditions page one day during the flooding. I think I did that on the 17th of March. So look at all the red warnings, the do not enter here signs, all of eastern and northeastern Nebraska. Basically, what's that saying is that if you were trying to travel by car, through Nebraska, through eastern and northeast Nebraska, well, you couldn't. You couldn't go across any bridges that went across any bodies of water. Highway 275, which leads to towns in northeast Nebraska like Fremont and Norfolk, West Point, then going up north towards the river on the north side, Niobrara, you just couldn't travel there because Highway 275 travels right along the Elkhorn River. The bridges along the Platte River to the west of Omaha, you couldn't travel. You couldn't travel to the town of Valley. You couldn't travel to any of those towns in the valley there. You couldn't get past the valley. It would be difficult to get to Lincoln or Omaha or any place else from there. So that's just an impact on, how we travel, and that is by car. I have a couple more images. These images I just lifted. Some of these showed up in the World Herald website. And I use this slide actually to think about how the impact of a natural disaster like this is connected with public policy. So up there in the upper left-hand corner is, an image of some agricultural land. And so we think about agricultural policy. The Farm Bureau of Nebraska, which, by the way, does have its own partisan stance, which that's not really relevant. They do actually some good research on agricultural policy. They projected that the impact of these floods, will be close to $1 billion. So they were talking about agricultural land that had been inundated by floodwaters now, and the damage done to the infrastructure, houses, buildings, equipment on that land, plus the impact of not being able to plant this spring because of the saturation in the water. And so they were looking at somewhere between 800 million and $1 billion of impact on agriculture, just on the ag sector alone. And then in the lower left-hand corner, that's Dodge Street, going across the Elkhorn River. So Dodge Street is what you take to get on Highway 275 to go up to Fremont and Norfolk. And of course, Dodge Street was inundated by the Elkhorn River, and you couldn't pass it. But now there may be damage to the surface of that road. And so now we're talking about transportation policy, right? And we know that highway funding is funded primarily by gas taxes at the federal and state levels. So what's the impact on highway funding policy of an event like this? In the middle there, I have a picture of a Burlington Northern, a BNSF train that happens to be just sitting on the inundated track, and I believe that track is near Plattsmouth, Nebraska. But both Burlington Northern and Union Pacific have, in their press releases, said, rail traffic is really going to be a mess for several weeks because there's been a lot of damage to their track infrastructure, which now has to be repaired, including bridges, some of which have come down, trestles, because of the storm. So that affects large transportation businesses in the United States. In the upper right-hand corner, that happens to be a picture from the east end of the runway at Offutt Air Force Base. And that runway, it's 10,000 feet, and it goes right towards the Missouri River. Well, the Missouri River breached its levees there and inundated about 3,000 feet of a 10,000-foot runway. Interestingly, the Defense Department had already funded a complete replacement of that runway. So from that standpoint, it might not be an additional expense, except that the flood inundated several buildings at Offutt Air Force Base as well. So now we're talking about an impact to Defense Department operation and maintenance costs. And in the lower right, that's the town of Fremont. And we know that Fremont was essentially cut off from, along with Valley, Fremont was essentially cut off from people being able to get in or out of the town in any direction. And so what's the impact to the state of Nebraska and to the town of Fremont, the city of Fremont, and all these other cities, Valley, Norfolk, many cities that have been inundated by floodwaters? What's the impact on rebuilding their infrastructure, the impact on local businesses, the impact on local residents? And all of these, and kind of pulsing through all of these, is this notion of emergency management funding. It's not as if we don't think about emergency management funding. We have something called the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency. So it's not as if we don't think that natural disasters are ever going to occur. We know they're going to occur. But that is a separate line of budgeting, and how much do we budget for that? So the point is that policy analysis really inundates everything, and a natural disaster is one way to demonstrate how policies are interconnected. And so this week, here's a screenshot here. This week, what I'm asking you to do, this is right off the Canvas site, I'm asking you to look at some policy briefs, because this week I want to talk about the difference between short policy briefs and what I would call a full-blown policy analysis. So here's the things I'm asking you to look at this week, and let me take them in order. So first of all, I want you to look at BARDAC Appendix A. So BARDAC Appendix A happens to be a policy study from the RAND Corporation, which I'm going to also reference separately here. But it's really more along the lines of a policy brief. It's a little bit longer than the one I'm asking you to write. If you took the word count of that Appendix A, it's probably about a 20 or 25 page typical double-spaced paper. So a little bit longer than I'm asking you to write, but it really is a nice demonstration of what a policy brief can look like. And starting out with a preface, which I would call an executive summary, the preface and the summary I'd call an executive summary, but then it goes into detail on the data, and it talks about alternatives, and then it gives options for considering the alternatives, and then it gives a conclusion, which is really what your policy brief is going to look like. And then I ask you, or I suggest that you go look at RAND Corporation itself. Okay, here's why I talk about RAND. RAND is probably one of the premier non-partisan policy think tanks in the United States. It has an interesting history. You can read about their history on their own website. It's been around since the end of World War II. But RAND also runs their own graduate school, accredited graduate school, and a lot of experts on policy analysis with PhDs in policy analysis have come out of RAND and their school. And so spend some time perusing RAND's website. They started out really looking at defense policy, but they have expanded into virtually every area of policy analysis. And I tell you to look at it because it's really a good source to begin looking at policy studies. And then I ask you to look at a particular policy analysis written in 2009 by their authors were Harrold, no relation, Harrold, Morris, and Ma. And this happened to be on China's efforts in the South China Sea. So this is a long policy analysis. So really what I want you to do, you don't have to read it word for word, but I'd like you to look at the site of that policy analysis, and then use that to compare the next things I'm asking you to look at. So I ask you to link on policy selections from the Brookings Policy Brief series, which is kind of old, and I don't think they're really updating it anymore, but nevertheless, it's good examples. I ask you to look at selections from the Center for Retirement Research. Just look at some of their policy briefs that are there. And then I ask you to look at two partisan policy study agencies, the Platt Institute of Nebraska and the Open Sky Institute of Nebraska. And so typically, if you work in the Nebraska legislature, and some of you do, you know that often the Platt Institute and Open Sky take opposite sides of policy debates. But I want you to look at some of the ways they provide policy briefs on those websites. And so our activity is we're just going to compare a full-blown policy analysis versus what I call policy briefs. And so why do I ask you to do that? So this goes back to chapter 6 of the craft text. You've seen this before. This is the chart that talks about how we evaluate public policy proposals. Okay, so why do I throw this back in? This is really a core of your project, of your policy brief. It's important to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of policy through the lens of through some particular criterion or through some set of criteria, through which you're going to evaluate policy. And now we've gotten to that point of the project. That was part 3. I made some comments back to each of you on part 3. And so now you're at the point of revising your project and actually taking those criteria and evaluating your alternatives through the lenses of those criteria, and then coming to a conclusion. And your conclusion is, what is the recommended policy action that has to be made at this point? And so what I'm getting at with having you read those policy briefs is this very question. But I started out this lecture with the movie The Sixth Sense, 20 years old now. We think about policy all the time. And in fact, I'd say we probably do it too much. Not only do we see policy walking around, we see people talking about policy and they don't know they're talking about policy all the time. So the the flood the floods in Nebraska kind of serve to remind us that a natural disaster has tentacles that spread into all kinds of national and state level and local level policy. Um, but my problem is my posit that I make here is, do we really think about policy? So as a rhetorical question, all these questions are rhetorical here. How does the age that we live in, the hypermedia age, I call it, either focus our attention on policy or alternatively distract us from focusing? That is, every single day you can go on Twitter, or you can go on Facebook, or you can go, on Instagram, and people are talking about stuff, right? Oh, look at the floods in Nebraska, and you know, this is evidence of global climate change or not. I don't know. Um, so let's focus on that for a few days until we get bored with that, and uh, then focus on something else. Um, so the question secondary to that is, are we able to really deliberate about the strategic roles of various policy domains? So I, just using the flood, I thought of several policy domains that impact, right? Like transportation, highway policy, waterway policy, defense policy, emergency management policy, um, budget policy. We're supposed to think about those things in strategic, deliberative senses, but the question is, in our hypermedia age, do we really do that? And so the bigger question to me, thinking about policy, is, are we constantly wading into what John Kingdon was writing about way back in 1984, so 34, 35 years ago, in his book, Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies. That's the book where John Kingdon lays out the multiple streams, right? The problem stream, the politics stream, and the policy stream. And what Kingdon theorized in 1984 was that those streams don't ever cross until an opportunity comes up, and then they have a confluence in what he calls the window of opportunity. But my thinking is that we're constantly waiting in all those streams right now. We're constantly talking about problems. We're constantly involved in the politics stream. And we're constantly coming up with policy solutions for problems that exist, and they might only exist for a few days in our hypermedia news cycle. So those are just some things to think about going forward as you keep thinking about the impact of policy on our lives. So let's go back to this then, this screenshot of what I want you to read this week, and the question is then, how do these affect our thinking about policy? So here's what I want you to talk about in the discussion for this week. I want you to look at the policy briefs that I present to you. That includes Appendix A of BARDAC, along with all those links that I provide for you. And I'd like you to discuss these three questions in this week's discussion. So what are the general differences in methodology between the more expansive policy study and policy briefs? That's one question. The second is, in the policy briefs, could you detect the clear use of evaluative criteria, that is, that slide, from Craft Chapter 6 to evaluate the policies in question? All the policy briefs don't necessarily have a subtitle heading that says evaluative criteria. So I'm asking you, can you pick out the evaluative criteria that they're using, and what are those? And then I threw in those so-called partisan think tanks. So I want to ask if you can pick out the differences in tone that you see in those partisan think tanks vis-a-vis the other presentations. So that's it for this week. You should be continuing to work on your project, and I know you are. Please do contact me if you have questions about that as we go along. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.